One bullet. That was all it took to turn a peaceful life into a desperate hunt. Clara Vance wasn't supposed to survive the raid on her homestead, and she certainly wasn't supposed to steal the one thing the corrupt Sheriff Montgomery Thorne would kill to keep hidden. Now, bleeding and alone in the vast emptiness of the Wyoming Territory, Clara is losing hope. But she isn't as alone as she thinks. Out of the shadows steps a man with a dark past and a faster gun, a man who shouldn't be her savior. Watch the story of how a broken woman and a dangerous drifter brought an entire corrupt empire to its knees. Pain had a sound. For Clara Vance, it was the sharp, rhythmic hiss of her own breath escaping through gritted teeth. She sat slumped against the rough-hewn wall of an abandoned trapper's cabin, clutching her side. The fabric of her dress, once a soft calico blue, was now stiff and dark with dried blood. Outside, the Wyoming night was deceptively quiet, save for the distant, mournful cry of a coyote that sounded too much like a human scream for her liking. She had been running for 3 days. 3 days since Sheriff Montgomery Thorne, a man who wore the law like a mask to hide a monster, had burned her world to ash. She had escaped with nothing but the clothes on her back and the leather satchel currently tucked beneath her trembling legs. But Thorne's deputy, a soulless man named Pike, had clipped her with a rifle shot from a ridge 2 miles back. Clara looked down at the wound. It was angry and inflamed. She knew enough about frontier medicine to know that if she didn't clean it, the fever would take her long before Thorne's posse did. She reached for the rusted knife she had found on the cabin's floor. She needed to cut away the fabric, but her hands shook so violently she dropped the blade. It clattered against the wood, the noise sounding like a cannon blast in the silence. Tears of frustration welled in her eyes. She squeezed them shut. "I can't," she sobbed into the darkness. "It hurts too much." The floorboards creaked. Clara's eyes snapped open. She scrambled for the knife, ignoring the agony in her side, but a boot stamped down on the blade, pinning it to the floor. She looked up, terror seizing her throat. Standing over her was a silhouette framed by the moonlight streaming through the open door. He was tall, wearing a long, dust-coated duster and a low-brimmed hat that obscured his eyes. The silver glint of a Colt peacemaker on his hip was the only clean thing about him. Clara pressed her back against the logs, bracing for the final shot. This was it. Thorne had sent a hired gun to finish what the deputy started. "Do it!" she hissed, her voice trembling but defiant. "Just do it quickly." The stranger didn't draw his weapon. Instead, he slowly knelt. The movement was fluid, like water flowing over rocks. He reached out a gloved hand, not toward her throat, but toward the wound on her side. Clara flinched, trying to pull away. "I said, it hurts too much." The stranger paused. He tilted his head up slightly, the moonlight finally catching the hard, angular lines of his face. He had a scar running through his left eyebrow, and eyes that looked older than the mountains outside. His name was Caleb Ryland, though Clara didn't know that yet. She only knew he looked dangerous, the kind of dangerous that frightened wolves. Caleb's voice was a low rumble, like thunder in a canyon. "That's why I'm here." Clara froze. "What?" "Pain means you're still alive, Mrs. Vance," Caleb said softly. He pulled a clean flask and a strip of white linen from his duster pocket. "And as long as you're alive, Thorne hasn't won." "You know who I am?" Clara stammered, her hand still hovering near the trapped knife. "Are you with him? Did he send you?" Caleb poured a measure of whiskey onto the linen. The smell filled the small cabin, sharp and biting. "If Thorne sent me, you wouldn't have heard the floorboard creak." He moved his hand to her side. "This is going to burn like hellfire. Don't scream. Sound carries in the valley." Clara nodded, biting down on her lip until she tasted iron. Caleb pressed the whiskey-soaked cloth against the wound. The world went white. Clara arched her back, a silent scream dying in her throat as the alcohol seared the raw flesh. She gripped Caleb's forearm, her nails digging into the tough leather of his coat. He didn't flinch. He held the compress steady, his other hand resting gently on her shoulder, grounding her. As the initial wave of agony subsided into a dull, throbbing ache, Clara slumped back, panting. She looked at the man again. Up close, he didn't look like a killer. He looked tired. "Why?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Why help me?" Caleb began binding the wound with practiced efficiency. "Because Montgomery Thorne killed my brother in Abilene 4 years ago, and because I saw what you took from his safe." Clara's hand flew to the satchel beneath her legs. "You want it?" "I don't want the money, and I don't want the deeds," Caleb said, tying off the bandage. He sat back, resting his arms on his knees. "I want the ledger." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. The ledger, the small black book she had grabbed blindly while the house burned. She hadn't even looked inside it yet. "The ledger proves he's stealing land from the Railroad Commission," Caleb explained, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the dark woods outside. "It proves he's not just a sheriff, but a thief and a murderer. You have the nail, Mrs. Vance. I'm just the hammer." Clara stared at him. "You're using me." "We're using each other," Caleb corrected. He stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the gloom. "You need to stay alive. I need that book to hang him. It's a fair trade." "He has 20 men," Clara said, her hope deflating. "Maybe more. You're just one cowboy." Caleb turned back to her, and for the first time, a grim, humorless smile touched his lips. "I ain't a cowboy, ma'am. I'm a retireed U.S. Marshal, and Thorne doesn't know I'm here." Suddenly, the distant sound of hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls. They were faint, but getting louder. Caleb's expression hardened. He drew his Colt, checking the cylinder with a metallic click. "Can you stand?" Clara tried to push herself up, but her legs wobbled. "I think so." "Think harder," Caleb said, extinguishing the small lantern he had lit. The cabin plunged into darkness. "Because they found your blood trail. We have 5 minutes before this cabin becomes a coffin." The night air was freezing, biting at Clara's exposed skin as Caleb virtually carried her out the back door of the cabin. They moved not toward the open plains, but up, toward the jagged scree of the ridge overlooking the small structure. "Stay low," Caleb whispered. "Step where I step. No loose rocks." Clara gritted her teeth against the fire in her side. Every step was a battle, but the fear of what lay behind them was a potent motivator. They scrambled up the slope, hiding behind a cluster of boulders, just as the riders burst into the clearing below. There were 6 of them. Clara recognized the lead rider immediately, Deputy Pike. He was a massive man with a beard that looked like a bird's nest and a cruelty that was legendary in the county. He slid off his horse, a torch in one hand and a repeater rifle in the other. "She's here," Pike shouted, kicking the cabin door open. "I can smell the blood." From their vantage point, 50 feet above, Clara watched as 3 men stormed the tiny shack. The sound of furniture being smashed echoed up to them. "They'll see we're gone in seconds," Clara whispered to Caleb. "I'm counting on it," Caleb murmured. He was resting his revolver on a flat rock, sighting down the barrel. "You said you were a marshal," Clara whispered. "You can't just shoot them in cold blood." "I'm not a marshal anymore," Caleb replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "And that's not cold blood. That's pest control." Down below, Pike emerged from the cabin, furious. "Gone. The trail goes out the back. Fan out. She's hurt. She can't have got far." One of the men, a tracker named Silas Dean, knelt by the back door. He held up a lantern. "Fresh tracks, boss. Heading up the ridge. 2 sets." Pike looked up, his eyes scanning the darkness right where Clara and Caleb were hiding. 2 sets? She got herself a guardian angel. Pike raised his rifle. "Light up the ridge." "Get down!" Caleb shoved Clara's head down, just as the rocks around them exploded into dust. Bullets whined off the granite, sparking in the dark. Caleb didn't return fire immediately. He waited. The shooting from below was chaotic, wild. They were firing at shadows. Caleb was waiting for a target. "You need to run," Caleb said over the roar of gunfire. "There's a game trail that leads over the crest. Follow it to the creek." "I'm not leaving you," Clara yelled back. It wasn't bravery, it was terror. Without him, she was dead. "I can't fight them if I'm worrying about you catching a stray bullet," Caleb snapped. "Go! I'll catch up." Clara hesitated, then scrambled backward, staying low. She had made it 10 yards when the firing stopped. "Hold fire!" Pike's voice boomed from below. "Someone's up there. Come on down, friend. Hand over the girl and the book, and you can ride away." Clara froze. She looked back at Caleb. He hadn't moved. "You hear me?" Pike yelled. "Thorn pays well for cooperation." Caleb stood up slowly from behind the rock. He was silhouetted against the moon. "I hear you, Pike," Caleb's voice carried effortlessly. "Who the hell are you?" Pike demanded. "The man who's going to tell you to turn around," Caleb called back. "Go back to Thorn. Tell him the ledger is gone. Tell him his time is up." Pike laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You got a name, dead man?" "Ryland. Caleb Ryland." The silence that followed was heavy. Even from a distance, Clara saw Pike stiffen. The name meant something. "Ryland died in Kansas," Pike shouted, though his voice lacked its previous confidence. "Kill him! Kill them both!" The gunfire erupted again. But this time, Caleb answered. His first shot took the lantern out of Silas Dean's hand, plunging the group below into semi-darkness. The second shot hit the dirt in front of Pike's horse, causing the animal to rear and throw the deputy to the ground. Chaos ensued. The horses panicked. Caleb fired 3 more times, precise, measured shots. He wasn't shooting to kill, not yet. He was shooting to scatter. One man yelled as a bullet shattered his rifle stock. Another cursed as his hat was blown off. "Go!" Caleb roared at Clara without looking back. Clara turned and ran. She scrambled over the crest of the ridge, her breath tearing at her lungs. She slid down the other side, tearing her dress on thorns, stumbling toward the sound of rushing water. Blackwood Creek. She didn't stop until she reached the muddy bank. She collapsed, gasping, listening to the war raging on the other side of the hill. Then, silence. She waited. 1 minute. 2. Had they killed him? Had her protector died for a stranger? A twig snapped behind her. Clara spun around, raising a heavy rock she had grabbed from the riverbed. Caleb stepped out of the brush. He was breathing hard, and there was a fresh graze on his cheek, bleeding sluggishly. He holstered his gun. "You're slow," he said flatly. Clara dropped the rock, her knees giving way. They're regrouping," Caleb said. He walked past her and waded into the freezing creek. "They won't follow us into the water at night. Too easy to lose the trail. We have to walk upstream. 1 mile, maybe 2. "In the water?" Clara asked, shivering. "It's freezing." Caleb turned back, offering his hand. His expression was softer this time. "The cold numbs the pain, Clara. Come on. If we stop, we die." She took his hand. His grip was iron strong. As they waded into the icy current, the reality of her situation settled in. She wasn't just a widow on the run anymore. She was a partner to a ghost, a man named Caleb Ryland, who had supposedly died years ago. They walked until sunrise. The creek had led them into a narrow canyon, hidden from the sprawling plains where Thorn's riders would be searching. When Caleb finally decided it was safe to stop, they were deep in a grove of aspen trees, the white bark glowing in the morning light. Clara couldn't feel her feet. Her side was a dull, throbbing weight, but the bleeding had stopped. Caleb built a small fire, smokeless, using dry twigs and bark in the shelter of a rock overhang. "Dry your boots," he commanded. "Trench foot will kill you slower than a bullet, but it hurts more." Clara sat by the fire, shivering. She opened the leather satchel. It was time to see what she had actually stolen. She pulled out the black ledger. It was heavy, bound in cracked leather. Caleb sat opposite her, cleaning his gun with a methodical obsession. "Open it," he said. Clara flipped the cover. The pages were filled with handwriting, some of it neat, some of it scrawled hastily. There were names, dates, and amounts. "Read the entry for August 12th, 1883, Caleb said without looking up. Clara thumbed through the pages. August 12th. Purchase of Miller Homestead. Payment, 0. Method, fire. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold water. He burned them out. "Keep reading," Caleb said. September 4th. Settlement with Union Pacific Surveyor. Payment, $500. Note, silence insured regarding water rights. Clara looked up. He's bribing the railroad surveyors to bypass the good land so he can buy it cheap. And killing anyone who won't sell, Caleb added. He finally looked up from his gun. Flip to the back. Look for the name Sterling. Clara turned to the last few pages. Her finger traced the lines until she stopped. Here. Governor Horace Sterling. Campaign contribution. $10,000. Delivered by hand. Clara gasped. "The governor? Thorn owns the governor?" "That's why you can't go to the law, Clara," Caleb said grimly. "Thorn is the law here, and the man above him is paid for." Clara slammed the book shut. "Then it's hopeless. If the governor is involved, who do we give this to? Who will believe us?" Caleb holstered his gun. "There's a federal judge in Denver, Judge Thaddeus Morgan. He's known as the hanging judge, but he's honest. He hates Sterling. If we get this book to him, he'll bring the cavalry." "Denver is 300 miles away," Clara said, her voice rising in panic. "Across open country, with 20 men hunting us." 21, Caleb corrected. "Pike won't stop. He's a bloodhound." "Why did you say you died in Kansas?" Clara asked suddenly. The question had been gnawing at her. Caleb stared into the small fire. His face seemed to age in the flickering light. "Because Caleb Ryland the Marshal had a wife. Her name was Sarah. Thorn. He was a cattle baron back then, not a sheriff. I tried to bring him in for rustling. I followed the law. I did everything by the book." He paused, his jaw tightening. "Thorn sent men to my home while I was at the courthouse. They burned it. Sarah didn't make it out." Clara covered her mouth. "Oh my God." "I tracked the men who did it," Caleb continued, his voice devoid of pity for himself. "I killed them all. But Thorn, he had political friends. He vanished. I was shot up bad in the final fight. The papers said I died. I let them believe it. It's easier to hunt a man when you're a ghost." He looked at Clara, his eyes burning with a cold intensity. "I've been looking for him for 5 years. I found him here, wearing a badge. I was going to just put a bullet in his head and be done with it. But then I saw you. You saw me. I was watching his ranch. I saw you go in. I saw you take the book. I knew if I saved you, we could do more than just kill him. We could destroy everything he built. We could ruin his name." Caleb leaned forward. "Death is too easy for a man like Thorn. I want to see him hang. I want him to know he lost." Clara looked at the ledger in her lap. It wasn't just evidence anymore. It was a weapon, and it was Sarah Ryland's vengeance. "We have to move," Caleb said, kicking dirt over the fire. "Pike will have picked up our trail at the creek by now. We need horses." "We don't have money," Clara said. "No," Caleb agreed, standing up and adjusting his hat. "But there's a relay station about 5 miles east. It's run by a man named O'Malley. He's a drunk, but he hates Thorn. He might help us." "And if he doesn't? Then we steal the horses," Caleb said simply. "I told you, Clara, I'm not a marshal anymore." They gathered their meager supplies. Clara winced as she stood, the pain in her side a constant companion. "Can you ride?" Caleb asked. Clara thought of her husband, shot down in their doorway. She thought of her home burning. She thought of Sarah Ryland. "I can ride," Clara said, her voice finding a new strength. "Good," Caleb said. He looked at the sky. Storm clouds were gathering over the peaks. "Because a storm is coming, and it's going to cover our tracks." As they stepped out of the aspen grove, Clara realized he wasn't talking about the weather. The wind had picked up, howling across the scrubland like a dying banshee, whipping Clara's hair across her face. By the time the silhouette of the relay station appeared on the horizon, she was barely staying in the saddle of her mind, let alone ready to ride a horse. They had been walking for hours. O'Malley's station was a dilapidated structure of rotting timber and mud brick, leaning precariously against the wind. A corral out back held 3 horses, poor beasts, ribs showing, heads low. "Stay here," Caleb rasped. He looked worse than she felt. The graze on his cheek had stopped bleeding, but his face was pale, his eyes fever-bright. "If you hear shooting, run into the brush and don't come out until it's dark." "I'm coming with you," Clara said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I'm done waiting in the dark." Caleb looked at her, really looked at her. For a long moment. He saw the shift in her. The terrified widow was receding. Something harder was taking her place. He nodded once. "Keep your hands visible. O'Malley is jumpy." They approached the main building. The door creaked open before they even reached the steps. A short, pot-bellied man with a shotgun leveled at Caleb's chest stood in the gloom. "That's close enough, stranger," O'Malley spat. Tobacco juice stained his grey beard. "O'Malley," Caleb said, keeping his hands away from his hips. "It's Ryland. I need 2 horses, fresh ones." O'Malley squinted, then lowered the gun slowly. "Ryland? Ghost of the Plains? Heard you were dead. Heard Pike put you under in Kansas." "Pike is a liar," Caleb said. "We need horses. I can pay you in." "I don't need your coin," O'Malley interrupted, his eyes darting nervously to the ridge behind the station. "You need to get. Thorne's men came through an hour ago. Posted a bounty. $5,000 for the girl, dead or alive. $2,000 for anyone helping her." Clara stiffened. $5,000 was a fortune. It was enough to buy a new life, a new ranch, a new identity. "We just need the horses, O'Malley," Caleb said, his voice dropping an octave. "We'll be gone." "I can't do it, Caleb," O'Malley said, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. "If they find out I helped you—" "If you don't help us, they'll kill us right here," Clara spoke up. She stepped forward into the light. "And you look like a man who knows what it's like to be afraid of Montgomery Thorne." O'Malley looked at her. He saw the blood on her dress, the desperation in her eyes. For a second, his resolve wavered. But then, his gaze shifted past them, toward the barn. Caleb saw the look. It was a micro-expression, a glance of guilt. "Get down!" Caleb roared, shoving Clara off the porch. The blast of a shotgun tore through the space where Clara had been standing. O'Malley hadn't fired, The shot came from the barn. "You sold us out!" Caleb yelled, rolling behind a water trough. He drew his peacemaker and fired blindly at the barn loft. "I had to!" O'Malley screamed, dropping to his knees. "They have my boy. Pike took my boy." From the barn, muzzle flashes lit up the dusk. 3 men. Thorne had left a rear guard, anticipating Caleb might head for the only fresh horses in 20 miles. Bullets chewed up the wood of the trough, splinters raining down on Caleb. "Clara, can you move?" "I'm okay," she yelled from behind a stack of barrels. "Cover your ears." Caleb stood up, exposing himself to fire. He fanned the hammer of his Colt. Pop, pop, pop. 2 men in the barn loft screamed and fell silent. The third, a rifleman, ducked back. "O'Malley!" Caleb shouted. "Get inside!" But O'Malley didn't move. He sat on the porch, weeping. "They said they'd hurt him. They said—" The rifleman in the barn popped up. He didn't aim at Caleb. He aimed at the liability. He fired once. O'Malley slumped forward, a red flower blooming on his chest. "No!" Clara screamed. Caleb didn't hesitate. He saw the rifleman's head peek out to confirm the kill. Caleb fired his last round. The rifleman tumbled from the loft, crashing into the dirt. Silence returned to the station, heavier than before. Caleb reloaded, his hands shaking slightly. He walked over to O'Malley. The old man was gone. Caleb closed the man's eyes. "He betrayed us," Clara whispered, standing over the body. "And they killed him anyway." "That's how Thorne works," Caleb said, his voice cold iron. "Loose ends don't get paid. They get cut." He turned to the corral. "Grab the horses. We take all 3. We ride 2, lead 1. We ride them into the ground if we have to." Clara looked at the dead men, then at the desolate horizon. "Where are we going?" "Thorne expects us to go to Denver," Caleb said, tightening the cinch on a roan mare. "He'll have the roads blocked. He'll have the telegraph lines watching every station. So we can't go to Denver." Clara felt panic rising again. "We're going to Denver." Caleb swung into the saddle, grimacing as his old wounds pulled. "But we're not taking the road. We're taking the Devil's Throat." Clara stared at him. "The mountain pass. It's suicide in winter." "It's the only place Pike won't follow in the dark," Caleb said, extending a hand to help her up. "And it's the only way we stay ahead of the news of our death." The Devil's Throat was less a pass and more a jagged scar running through the peaks of the Rockies. The wind here didn't just blow, it screamed. It carried ice shards that cut exposed skin like glass. They had been riding for 2 days. The horses were failing. The roan mare Clara rode had gone lame 4 hours ago, forcing them to double up on Caleb's massive black stallion, a beast named Jericho. The proximity was maddening and comforting all at once. Clara sat behind Caleb, her arms wrapped around his waist, her face pressed against the rough leather of his duster to shield herself from the wind. She could feel the heat of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing. She could also feel him shivering. "You're burning up," she shouted over the wind. "I'm fine," Caleb lied. His voice was weak. The graze on his cheek had infected, and the old bullet wounds in his chest, reminders of the life he left behind, ached in the freezing altitude. "We have to stop," Clara insisted. "The horse needs rest, and so do you." "If we stop, we freeze," Caleb muttered, swaying in the saddle. As if the mountain heard them, the sky opened up. It wasn't snow, it was freezing rain, a deluge of ice water that soaked them to the bone instantly. The temperature plummeted. "There!" Caleb pointed. A shallow cave, barely a recess in the rock face, offered shelter from the driving sleet. They guided the exhausted horse under the overhang. Caleb slid off and collapsed. He didn't catch himself. He just hit the stone floor. "Caleb!" Clara scrambled off the horse. She turned him over. His face was grey, sweat mixing with the rain on his brow. She dragged him deeper into the recess, away from the wind. She knew what this was: septic fever. His body was fighting too many battles at once. "The saddlebags," Caleb chattered, his teeth clicking together. "Quinine. Willow bark." Clara fumbled with the bags, her fingers numb. She found a small tin of powder and a canteen. She mixed it, lifting his head to help him drink. He gagged, then swallowed. "You have to keep the fire inside," Caleb deliriously muttered. He wasn't talking about a campfire. There was no wood here. He was talking about the will to live. Clara huddled next to him, sharing her body heat. She wrapped both of them in the damp blankets. The night stretched out, an eternity of howling wind and darkness. Around midnight, Caleb woke. He was lucid, but weak. "Clara," he whispered. "I'm here, if I don't make it down this mountain," he said, reaching into his coat and pulling out the ledger. "You take this. You don't run. You finish it." "Stop talking like that," Clara snapped, tears freezing on her cheeks. "You're the marshal. You're the hero." "I'm no hero," Caleb sighed, his eyes closing. "I was a man who loved the law more than his wife, and she paid for it. I'm just trying to balance the scales." Clara looked at his scarred face. She reached out, brushing the hair from his fevered forehead. "You saved me. That balances a lot." Caleb looked at her, his eyes vulnerable for the first time. "It hurts, Clara. Not the wounds, the memories. It hurts too much." Clara tightened her grip on him, pulling him closer, anchoring him to the present. She echoed the words he had said to her in the cabin, the words that had started this insane journey. "That's why I'm here," she whispered into the dark. "Pain means you're still alive, Caleb, and I'm not letting you die." The storm broke just before dawn. The sun rose over the peaks, turning the brutal landscape into a glittering palace of ice. Clara woke to find Caleb sitting up, checking his revolver. He looked terrible, gaunt and pale, but the fever had broken. The fire was back in his eyes. "We lost a day," he said, his voice raspy. "Pike will be at the railhead by now." "The railhead?" Clara asked, stiffly standing up and stretching her aching limbs. "Silverton," Caleb said, pointing down the valley where a plume of smoke rose in the distance. "The train to Denver leaves at noon. If we miss it, we're trapped in these mountains for the winter. And if Pike is there," Caleb holstered his gun, "then we buy a ticket." Silverton was not a town. It was a festering wound of civilization carved into the side of the San Juan Mountains. It was a place where mud, ambition, and desperation mixed in equal measure. The air hung heavy with the acrid stench of sulfur from the mines and the thick, choking coal smoke from the rail yard. To Caleb and Clara, who had spent days in the pristine, freezing silence of the high peaks, the noise was a physical assault. The clanging of hammers, the shouting of hawkers, and the relentless, rhythmic hiss of the steam engines. They abandoned the exhausted horse a mile outside of town, setting it loose in a patch of scrub grass. They couldn't risk riding in. Their faces were plastered on wanted posters from Wyoming to Colorado, stapled to telegraph poles and saloon doors. Clara scooped a handful of wet, dark earth from the roadside and smeared it across her cheeks and forehead, masking her pale complexion. She pulled a discarded, battered miner's hat low over her eyes. Caleb buttoned his duster to his chin, hiding the bandages and the gun belt, and pulled his brim down until he was nothing but a shadow with a gait. "Keep your head down," Caleb murmured, his eyes scanning the bustling crowd. "Don't make eye contact. Look like you belong to the mud." They moved through the throng like ghosts. The station platform was a chaotic sea of humanity. prospectors with eyes full of gold fever, weary whores in faded silk, and cattlemen shouting over the din. But dominating everything was the machine. The Union Pacific number 119 sat on the tracks, a massive beast of black iron and brass. It hissed and groaned, venting steam that obscured the platform in blinding white clouds. It looked less like a vehicle and more like a dragon waiting to be fed. "We can't buy tickets," Caleb whispered, pulling Clara into the shadow of a water tower. "Conductors check faces against the bounty lists, and Pike will have telegraphs waiting at every stop." "So how do we get on?" Clara asked, staring at the intimidating size of the engine. "The coal tender." Caleb nodded toward the open car directly behind the locomotive. "It's dirty, it's dangerous, and it's the only place they won't look until Denver." The conductor's whistle shrieked, a piercing sound that rattled Clara's teeth. The massive pistons of the engine began to pump. Chug, chug, chug. The iron wheels groaned against the steel rails. The train lurched forward. "Now!" Caleb hissed. They broke cover, sprinting alongside the moving train. The ground was slick with oil and ice. Clara's lungs burned as she pumped her legs, the massive iron wheels grinding just inches from her boots. One slip meant amputation, or worse. Caleb reached the metal ladder on the side of the tender first. He swung himself up, his boots clanging against the iron rungs. He held on with one hand, leaning out dangerously, extending the other toward her. "Jump, Clara!" She lunged. The train was picking up speed, the landscape blurring. Her hand slapped into Caleb's. His grip was like a vice. For a terrifying second, her feet left the ground, dangling over the churning wheels and the rushing gravel. With a grunt of exertion that tore at his healing wounds, Caleb hauled her up. She scrambled over the lip of the car and tumbled onto the shifting, unstable pile of coal. They lay there for a moment, gasping for air, the black dust coating their throats. The heat from the engine ahead was intense, radiating back through the metal wall, contrasting sharply with the freezing wind whipping over the top of the car. "We made it," Clara coughed, wiping grit from her eyes. "We're safe." Caleb didn't answer. He was staring toward the rear of the train. The wind whipped his coat around him. "Caleb?" "He's not stupid," Caleb whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the firebox. "He knew we couldn't take the road. He knew we couldn't buy tickets." Caleb slowly stood up, balancing on the shifting coal. He looked over the roof of the passenger car behind them. There, standing atop the roof of the last carriage, silhouetted against the retreating mountains, was a figure. A massive man in a bearskin coat, holding a repeater rifle with the casual ease of a reaper holding a scythe. Pike. He hadn't been waiting at the station. He had boarded the train miles back, anticipating the very move Caleb would make. He had been walking the roofs, hunting. "Get down!" Caleb roared, diving toward Clara. Crack! A bullet sparked off the iron rim of the tender, inches from where Caleb's head had been. The sound was swallowed by the wind, but the intent was clear. "He's on the roof!" Caleb yelled, pushing Clara toward the front, toward the engine cab. "Stay low, bury yourself in the coal." "What are you doing?" Clara screamed, grabbing his sleeve. "I can't fight him here," Caleb shouted back. "No cover! I have to take him to the cars." Caleb scrambled up the pile of coal and leaped across the gap to the roof of the first passenger car. The wind up there was ferocious, a physical force trying to peel him from the train. The world rushed by in a blur of pine trees and jagged rock. Pike saw him coming. The big deputy smiled, a predator enjoying the chase. He leveled his rifle again. Caleb dove, rolling across the arched roof of the carriage. A bullet tore through the wood beneath him, eliciting screams from the passengers inside. Caleb returned fire from his back, fanning the hammer of his peacemaker. Bang! Bang! The shots went wide, thrown off by the lurching of the train. But they forced Pike to duck. It was a suicidal dance. They ran toward each other across the tops of the moving cars, leaping the terrified gaps where the couplers groaned and gnashed. They met in the middle, atop the dining car. Pike's rifle clicked empty. With a snarl of frustration, he hurled the weapon at Caleb. Caleb dodged, but the heavy wood stock clipped his shoulder, spinning him around. "End of the line, Ryland!" Pike roared. His voice was a boom of thunder, louder than the train. "Thorne sends his regards." He drew a knife, not a standard blade, but a massive Bowie knife with a blade as wide as a man's hand. It glinted wickedly in the sun. Caleb's gun was empty. He didn't have time to reload. He drew his own knife, a simple, jagged hunting blade that looked like a toothpick compared to Pike's weapon. They circled each other on the narrow, curved roof. The train hit a bend, tilting sharply. Both men stumbled. Pike used the momentum, launching himself like a battering ram. He slammed into Caleb, and the air left Caleb's lungs in a rush. They hit the metal roof hard, sliding dangerously toward the edge. The drop was 100 feet into a rocky gorge. It was a brutal, ugly, desperate fight. There was no technique here, only survival. Pike slashed, the heavy blade slicing through Caleb's duster and biting into his forearm. Blood sprayed, hot and bright. Caleb grunted, driving a knee into Pike's groin, but the big man was fueled by a berserker rage. Pike dropped the knife and grabbed Caleb's throat with both hands. His thumbs dug into Caleb's windpipe, cutting off the air. "You should have stayed dead in Kansas." Pike grinned, his teeth yellow and rotten, spittle flying onto Caleb's face. "I'm going to throw you off this train and watch you bounce." Caleb clawed at Pike's wrists, but his strength was failing. The fever, the wounds, the exhaustion. It was all too much. His vision began to tunnel. The roar of the wind faded into a dull buzz. He looked up at the blue sky, realizing this was it. He had failed. Suddenly, a shadow fell over them. Pike blinked, sensing something. He looked up. Standing on the roof of the coal car, 10 feet away, was Clara. She had crawled over the shifting black mounds. She was covered in soot, looking like a demon rose from the earth. In her 2 shaking hands, she held the small, pearl-handled derringer Caleb had given her days ago. "Get off him!" she screamed. The wind tore the words from her mouth, but the intent remained. Pike laughed. "Go back to your cooking, girl. I'll deal with you in a—" Pop. The sound was small, almost insignificant against the noise of the locomotive. Pike stiffened. A look of profound confusion crossed his rugged face. He looked down at his chest. A small, neat hole had appeared in the center of his bare-skin coat. He wheezed, a wet, rattling sound. The grip on Caleb's throat loosened. "You," Pike whispered, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. He tried to stand, to rush her, but his legs had turned to water. The train lurched again, hitting a switch track. Pike stumbled backward. His arms flailed, grasping for a handhold that wasn't there. He tipped over the edge. There was no scream, just a flash of fur and limbs, and then he was gone, swallowed by the ravine below. Caleb lay on the roof, gasping, massaging his bruised throat. He rolled over, coughing violently. He looked up at Clara. She hadn't moved. She was still holding the smoking gun, staring at the empty space where Pike had been. Her hands were trembling so hard the gun rattled. Caleb crawled back across the gap, ignoring the pain in his arm. He reached the coal car and gently took the weapon from her fingers. "Clara," he rasped. She looked at him, her eyes wide, the white stark against the coal dust on her face. "I killed him." "You saved us," Caleb said, his voice firm despite the rasp. He holstered the tiny gun. "You did what the law couldn't do. You delivered justice." He pulled her down into the coal, out of the wind. They huddled there as the train sped on, leaving the mountains and the bodies behind. Ahead, the smoke of Denver stained the horizon. The wilderness was behind them, but the true monster, the man in the suit, was still waiting. Denver was not merely a city, it was an assault on the senses. To Caleb and Clara, who had spent days fighting the silence of the mountains and the howling winds of the high passes, the capital was a cacophony of industrial progress. The air here didn't smell of pine and rain. It reeked of coal smoke, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of machinery. Electric arc lamps sputtered on the main thoroughfares. A new, jarring magic that cast harsh, flickering shadows against the brick facades of the buildings. They moved through the back alleys like wraiths. They were a terrifying sight to behold. Caleb's duster was shredded, stained with the dark rust of dried blood and the grim soot of the locomotive's coal tender. Clara, once the picture of a gentle homesteader, looked like a spectre of vengeance, her face smeared with grime, her eyes burning with a feverish intensity born of adrenaline and exhaustion. Passers-by on the boardwalks recoiled as they emerged onto the main street, clutching their purses and children tight. They didn't see a hero and a victim. They saw desperation. "The courthouse is 3 blocks up," Caleb rasped. His voice was a ruin, his throat raw from the smoke of the train. He kept his right hand inside his coat, resting near the butt of his Colt Peacemaker. He was running on fumes, his body held together by sheer willpower and the knowledge that if he stopped moving, he would never start again. "We have to hurry," Clara whispered, clutching the leather satchel to her chest. "If Thorne has friends here, if he sent a telegram—" "He did," Caleb said grimly. "We're walking into a trap, Clara. But it's the only place the trap can't snap shut without noise." The Denver County Courthouse loomed before them, a fortress of gray granite and white marble designed to intimidate. It was a sanctuary of law in a lawless land, its massive columns speaking of permanence and order. They ascended the wide stone steps. A bailiff, a man with a walrus mustache and a uniform that looked too tight, stepped out from the shadow of the portico to block their path. He took one look at Caleb's bloodied coat and wrinkled his nose in disgust. "Court is in session," the bailiff sneered, placing a heavy hand on his baton. "No vagrants. Go beg at the Mission down on Larimer Street." Caleb didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. He simply looked up, the brim of his hat tilting just enough to reveal eyes that were colder than the blizzard they had survived. "Step aside," Caleb said. It wasn't a shout. It was a command, delivered with the low, vibrating menace of a growling wolf. "My name is Caleb Ryland, and I am here to see Judge Morgan." The bailiff faltered. The name Ryland was a ghost story in the West, a legend of a dead marshal. The hesitation was all Caleb needed. He shouldered past the man, Clara close on his heels, and they pushed through the heavy oak doors. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of floor wax and old paper. They moved down the central corridor, ignoring the stares of clerks and lawyers, and burst through the double doors of courtroom 302. The room was packed. A droning land dispute was underway, with a bored-looking lawyer gesturing at a map. The interruption was absolute. The heavy doors slammed open, echoing like a gunshot in the high-ceilinged chamber. Silence descended instantly, heavy and suffocating. Judge Thaddeus Morgan sat high upon the bench. He was a man carved from the same granite as the building, with snowy white mutton chops and spectacles that magnified his stern, judgmental gaze. He peered over the rim of his glasses, his gavel hovering in mid-air. "What is the meaning of this?" Morgan boomed, his voice filling the room. "Bailiff, remove these people immediately." Judge Morgan! Caleb's voice cut through the room, ragged but powerful. He walked down the center aisle, his boots thudding heavily on the wood floor. I am Caleb Ryland, formerly of the U.S. Marshal Service, and I am bringing you a crime in progress. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Ryland? The dead Marshal? Reporters in the front row began scribbling furiously. And this, Caleb gestured to Clara, who stepped into the pool of light before the bench, is Clara Vance. We have evidence regarding racketeering, arson, and murder committed by Sheriff Montgomery Thorne. Lies! The word cracked like a whip from the back of the courtroom. The heavy double doors swung open again. Montgomery Thorne stood there, framed by the entryway. He was impeccable. He wore a tailored grey suit, a silk vest, and a polished badge that gleamed under the electric lights. He had taken the express train, a private carriage. He was rested, clean, and radiating the confident aura of a man who owned the world. Behind him stood two uniformed Denver police officers, looking uncertain but deferring to the sheriff's authority. Thorne strode down the aisle, his smile tight and predatory. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like a senator. Your Honor, Thorne said, his voice smooth as oil, bowing slightly to the judge. I apologize for the disruption. These two are dangerous fugitives. They are wanted for the murder of my deputy, Elias Pike, and a station master named O'Malley. They are desperate, violent, and quite possibly insane. Thorne turned to face the gallery, playing to the crowd. This man, Ryland, is a disgraced former lawman with a vendetta. And the woman, a tragic, hysterical widow who has been brainwashed. I am here to take them into custody. He looked at Caleb, his eyes dancing with triumph. It's over, Ryland. Put your hands up. The room swayed. The narrative was shifting. Thorne was the respectable authority. Caleb and Clara were the dirty, bloody interlopers. The Denver police officers' hands drifted to their batons, stepping forward. He's lying, Clara cried out, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with fury. He killed my husband. He burned our home. Hearsay. Thorne dismissed her without looking, keeping his eyes on the judge. Your Honor, permit me to remove this trash from your courtroom so you may continue. Judge Morgan, Caleb said, his hand hovering inches from his holster. The tension in the room ratcheted up, suffocatingly tight. If your officers touch us, there will be blood on this floor. I suggest you look at the evidence before you sign our death warrants. Morgan looked between the pristine sheriff and the rugged drifter. He was a hanging judge, but he was also a man who prided himself on absolute procedure. Evidence? Morgan grunted. What evidence? Clara stepped forward, bypassing the bailiff who tried to intercept her. She slammed the black ledger onto the judge's high desk. Dust flew from the cover. The ledger, Clara announced, her voice ringing clear. It details every bribe, every land theft, every murder, including the order to burn the Miller homestead on August 12th. Page 42. Thorne's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A forgery, he scoffed quickly. Fabricated by a desperate woman. Clara turned to face Thorne. For weeks she had run from this man. Now she stood her ground. If it is a forgery, Sheriff, then you must explain the last entry, page 88. She looked back at the judge. The receipt for a $10,000 campaign contribution to Governor Horace Sterling, stamped with the governor's personal wax seal. The air left the room. The governor? Thorne's face drained of color. He knew what was in the book, but he hadn't realized she had found the governor's connection. That seal was undeniable. It was a death sentence for his career and likely his life. Judge Morgan's expression shifted from annoyance to grave seriousness. He picked up the book. He adjusted his spectacles. He flipped to the back. The silence stretched for an agonizing minute. The only sound was the rustle of paper and the ticking of the courtroom clock. Thorne shifted his weight. His eyes darted to the exits, then to the deputies, then to Caleb. He looked like a wolf realizing the trap had closed. Judge Morgan looked up. His eyes were hard, devoid of any warmth. He looked at Thorne with the contempt one reserves for something stuck to the bottom of a boot. "Sheriff Thorne," Morgan said, his voice low and dangerous. "Surrender your weapon." "Now, Thaddeus," Thorne stammered, his charm evaporating, replaced by a sheen of sweat. "Let's not be hasty. That book is clearly—" "I recognize Horace Sterling's seal," Morgan roared, slamming his hand down. "Bailiff! Arrest this man for high treason, corruption, and murder!" Thorne snapped. The mask of the politician fell away, revealing the killer beneath. He knew he wouldn't make it to a jail cell. He would hang. Panic, primal and ugly, took the wheel. "No!" Thorne screamed. His hand flew to his hip. He was fast, faster than any politician had a right to be. The gallery screamed. The Denver police officers froze, caught off guard. But Caleb Ryland had been waiting for this moment for 5 years. He didn't panic. He didn't hesitate. He was the storm that had finally made landfall. Bang! The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Thorne's revolver had barely cleared leather when the bullet struck. It didn't hit his heart. It didn't hit his head. Caleb had aimed with surgical precision. The slug tore through Thorne's right shoulder, shattering the bone and severing the nerve. Thorne's gun clattered harmlessly to the floorboards. He spun around from the impact, crashing to his knees, clutching his ruined arm. He howled, a sound of pain and disbelief. Caleb stood there, the peacemaker smoking in his hand, the hammer already pulled back for a second shot that wasn't needed. The room was frozen, every eye on the barrel of his gun. "I told you," Caleb said, his voice cutting through Thorne's whimpers. He looked down at the man who had taken everything from him. "Death is too easy for you, Montgomery. You don't get to die fighting. You get to die in a cage." He holstered his gun with a final, metallic click. "He stands trial," Caleb announced to the stunned courtroom. "He hangs." The spell broke. The Denver police, shaking off their shock, swarmed Thorne, pinning him to the ground as he cursed and bled. Clara slumped against the judge's bench, her legs finally giving out. She looked at Caleb. Across the chaos of the courtroom, their eyes met. There was no celebration, no joy. Just the heavy, exhausted relief of survival. The war was over. 6 months later, the snows had melted in Wyoming. The land was green again. Clara stood on the porch of her rebuilt homestead. The ledger had done its work. Thorne was hanged in December. The governor resigned in disgrace. The Railroad Commission returned the stolen lands. A rider appeared on the horizon. Clara didn't reach for a gun this time. She smiled. Caleb Ryland didn't get down from his horse. He looked cleaner, younger, though the scars remained. "Moving on?" Clara asked. "Job's done," Caleb nodded. "Thought I'd head to California, see the ocean." Sarah always wanted to see the ocean. Clara walked to the fence. "You know, this ranch needs a foreman, someone who can handle wolves." Caleb tipped his hat, a genuine smile touching his eyes. "You don't need help anymore, Clara. You're the one who pulled the trigger on the train. You saved yourself." "Maybe," Clara said softly. "But it hurts less when you're not alone." Caleb paused. He looked at the horizon, then back at her. He swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground. "Well," he said, dusting off his coat, "I suppose California isn't going anywhere. If you enjoyed this story of justice and survival, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. Share this video with a friend who loves a good Western, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching.